The whole country is incredibly proud of our armed forces, and I believe we need to do more to recognise the remarkable men and women and place them at the front and centre of our society.
The Prime Minister warning the Commons of a summer of mounting casualties in Afghanistan and paying tribute to the suffering and sacrifice already made by British troops.
I believe it is right that we renew and reaffirm our commitment to the military covenant, that crucial contract between our country and those who risk their lives to ensure our security.
But even when soldiers survive such conflict with life and limb intact, there's growing evidence of the damage to their mental health that can occur. Last month, the coalition government announced a brand new scheme to give the troops earlier diagnosis and treatment for combat-related psychiatric disorders. But how strong is that commitment? And just how big is the mental health problem in the services? Official figures say only 1 in 1,000 deployed troops are later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet new research shows that at least 40 times that number report the symptoms when surveyed. So are lack of diagnosis and stigma in the forces hiding an epidemic of mental illness? And are soldiers afflicted with PTSD getting a fair deal when they are forced to leave the services?
We were on patrol in the desert. Vehicle in our convoy goes over an improvised explosive device, completely destroys the vehicle. I completely froze. My mind was racing. I knew exactly what was going on around me, but I just had absolutely no function over my body whatsoever. And that lasted for a good sort of 10-15 seconds. After that, I still tried to do my job, so I'd turn my weapon out and try to cover the scene.
A serviceman who is still in the armed forces and has asked us not to use his name. The incident about 18 months ago sent his mind into a state of shock from which it still hasn't fully recovered, not least because of the close friends of his who were caught up in the explosion.
It was hard to believe that anybody could have survived it, but I didn't know until the lads were just putting the body bags onto the helicopter. So that sort of gave me the sinking feeling, but it didn't register properly in my head until after the helicopter had taken off, the dust had cleared, and I stood in the middle of the desert with one of the other lads, and he sort of put his hand on my shoulder and asked me if I was alright, and I just asked him that question, and I was like, right, who was in the bags? And he just sort of told me their names and just went, yes, they're both dead. You know, to that point, it sort of sinks in.
He was involved in many other combat incidents, and in one case his actions in repelling attackers led to him being decorated for bravery. But on returning home to Britain, the war continued to replay in his head, in dramatic flashbacks and nightmares.
I rapidly went downhill, I hit the booze hard, I just locked myself away basically for a week, and I didn't really come out of my bedroom. I couldn't even face my own mum and dad. I got flashbacks, vivid flashbacks, as in there would be something that would trigger me off, so whether it be the news or a car door slamming, like just a bump or something, them little things just, they send your mind off, racing, and then all of a sudden you're back there and your heart's racing, you're sweating, you're shaking.
He rarely slept well, and he was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder by forces medics. He went on a course of treatment, but says his condition didn't improve. And he soon learned he had little future in the forces and would be granted a medical discharge.
The PTSD, what I've been diagnosed with, is a career ender, basically. We all know what happens if you get shot or if you stand on a landmine and stuff like that. That happens, and that's real, but this is also real. This needs to be addressed, and the education throughout the armed forces, right from frontline soldier level right up throughout the ranks, it needs to be hammered home, and it needs to be hammered home sooner rather than later, because this is going to get massive.
But what evidence is there to justify his belief that post-traumatic stress disorder does pose a big health threat to our armed forces?
There are about 30 beds. We have veterans who will come here for treatment. Many of them have found it very difficult to engage with services.
At Tyrwhitt House in Surrey, psychiatrists and therapists have been caring for the mental casualties of war for many years. It's a residential centre run by the veterans charity Combat Stress.
The most dominant condition is post-traumatic stress disorder, so 75% of them have it as a primary diagnosis, and 62% also have disorders including depression and alcohol problems.
Dr. Walter Busuttil, the medical director, has noted a steep rise in requests for help from service veterans over the last 5 years. PTSD sufferers often take 10 years or more to seek treatment, but he says Combat Stress has already been contacted by many of those who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan.
In the last year, we've had something like 1,300 new inquiries, people asking for help. Since 2005, this represents a 72% increase in the number of inquiries we've had.
How desperate are some of these people, these veterans, when they come to you?
In some cases, they are very ill indeed. We're seeing severe cases of dissociative post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, in Iraqi and Afghanistan veterans. They lose time, they can't concentrate well, they have blank periods in their memory, and that's really indicative of the kind of high dose of trauma they've been exposed to. They've done their duty by their country, and they've really tried to cope, but for some reason they've broken down.
I mean, some people have talked about a tidal wave of cases, others have talked about an epidemic. How would you characterise it?
Well, I don't think it's an epidemic yet, but it's certainly growing, and it might be an epidemic in about 2 or 3 years. So it would be better to plan services right now.
Earlier this year, the Commons Public Accounts Committee tried to find out what percentage of servicemen and women might have post-traumatic stress disorder. The MPs were working from a National Audit Office report, which gave what at first sight was a reassuringly low figure for the incidence of PTSD in troops who'd been sent to war zones. It said,
"The rate of post-traumatic stress disorder assessed in the UK in previously deployed service personnel was 1.1 per 1,000 personnel."
But some of the MPs were sceptical and suspected they weren't getting the full picture. Their doubts were reflected in their report.
The committee was concerned that mental health issues were not being picked up in troops. War is extremely stressful, and the committee was surprised that the reported incidence of mental health problems in the military is lower than that of the general UK population.
A Liberal Democrat MP who was on that committee, Dr. John Pugh, sought more detail over the incidence of PTSD in the forces and still wonders why only 1 in 1,000 deployed troops have later been diagnosed with it.
My suspicion is the figure is plain wrong, is probably a severe underestimate of what's going on, and that subsequent research will reveal this. It must be phenomenally stressful to be walking around an area where all your comrades and yourself are in imminent danger of being blown up. In those sort of scenarios, you do expect a much higher level of stress, even if the individual is well prepared, even if they have robust psychology when they go out there, even if they are supremely well trained. It was just struck me as radically implausible.